So here's the exterior structure of the actual eyeball. And when we think of eyeballs, we think of something that's a hollow sphere, a perfect circle, when in fact it's not. All right? The vast majority of the eye is actually round, but the front part of the eye, the part that actually does the seeing or the letting in of light, sticks out from the surface of that circle quite a bit. This outer little bulbous layer, okay, is called the cornea. And the cornea is really interesting because it's a clear, transparent piece of tissue. Because it has no blood vessels in it, the cornea is the only bodily tissue that can actually be given to someone else. And you don't have to worry about blood types. You don't have to worry about tissue matches because there's no vascular system going through the cornea. It is just a clear layer of tissue. And when you're an organ donor, you can actually, give up your corneas to someone else. The cornea's job is to be nice and clear because that is where all the light coming into the eye has to go through. So if you think about it, it's like having the cleanest window to look out from. You want to make sure that there's no blood vessels or nothing, that could be blocking any light rays from coming into the eye. So the cornea is at the forefront of the eye. And as soon as light rays, we're going to draw them like this, and we're going to say light rays are coming into the eye in this direction. Okay, so this eyeball is looking to the left of the screen. Okay, now, as soon as the light ray passes through the cornea, it's going to come into contact with a very thick but clear gelatinous material. Okay, a jelly. And this is called the aqueous humor. Now, the aqueous humor, one of the main things it does is it allows the cornea, it's a fluid that pushes the cornea out to give the cornea that convex kind of shape, that bulbous shape. Okay, and it's what prevents the cornea from actually just kind of collapsing in on itself. All right, there's a lot of pressure there, and there's a very tight seal. Okay, so the aqueous humor is totally clear, which is kind of good because if you want light to go through something, you want it to be as clear as possible. And then it hits the part of the eye that we notice most about eyeballs. Okay, it hits the actual pupil and iris of the eye. Now, let's assume that my eyes here are, I'm going to go with green because I've got green eyes. All right, so I'm going to draw in the actual colored part of my eyeball here. All right. And this is like I've cut the eyeball in two here. I've cut it right down the middle, and I'm looking at a cross-section of the eye, from the rear of the eye to the front of the eye, right down through the iris and the pupil. Okay? The iris, which is the colored part of your eye, that's how you get that through genetics, depending on what either of your biological parents have. The brown and the blue are, dominant versus recessive. Green comes in with a bunch of other genes. Now, the job of the iris, it's a muscle. And its function is to act kind of like the shutter does on a camera, where the iris can actually constrict and get, the muscle itself can get larger, making the hole it's blocking smaller. If you take a light and you shine it into someone's eyes, their pupils get very small, okay, which means the iris gets bigger. The iris's job is to modify the size of the pupil. Okay, the pupil is that empty black space behind it, right here. So the pupil can actually be a little bit larger, okay? And depending on what, or the amount of light coming into the iris, or coming into the iris will either contract and be very, very small, or in low light situations, the iris of the eye will appear much like a much smaller ring because it's trying to make the pupil as big as possible. Okay? So the pupil here, now this is actually where the light goes into. So if I've still got my nice little yellow light beam here, it's going to go through the pupil. Okay, the pupil is actually an opening. We see it as black, but it's actually an opening into the eye. And if you go to an optometrist and they look in your eye with a flashlight or a little, pencil light or whatever, they can actually see into the eyeball itself. It's really cool stuff. Okay, so pupil will label, and the pupil is what allows light into the eye. Okay, so this whole part here, we're just talking about that front end of the eye. All right? The job of all of these, the cornea, the aqueous humor, the iris, and the pupil, is to let light in. That's the whole point. Now, once light is actually in, we're going to talk about the different layers of the eye and what is in each of these layers and what their functions are. But before we do that, we're going to kind of hit one last little piece that's up close here, and that is a lens. You have, it's quite hard actually, a hard clear material that basically hovers it's attached and it hovers just behind the pupil. And that is an actual lens that will actually make images. That is what will actually focus the images into the back of your brain. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about the layers of the eyeball in just a moment. So the sclera is a thicker white tissue. It's and you can actually touch your sclera and it doesn't actually do anything. And you can actually put your hand in your eye and you can touch your sclera and you can actually feel, if you press on the inside of your eye, you can feel that there's pressure there giving back. Okay, and you can touch the sclera, it's fine. It is moist all the time. Now, what actually gives nourishment to all the cells in and around the eye is this little red layer. Okay, and that's a layer of tissue. I've drawn it in red, but it's a layer of tissue called the choroid. Okay, and the choroid's job is to basically, because it's a blood-rich tissue, it's to feed all of the eye cells. The part that's actually in orange here is pretty much where the sensory receptors of the eye live. It's a very, very important part of your eye, and it's called your retina. Your retina starts at the sides, at the front of the eye, at the sides of where the cornea attaches on the inside, and it is an interior layer that wraps around the entire eye. And it links down at the bottom. Okay, it actually continues on here, and it is what is going to actually form your optic nerve. Okay, it doesn't actually stop down at the bottom. It is going to form your optic nerve. Now, the retina has two types of sensory receptors. The two types of sensory receptors in the eye will capture or be used in two very different instances. They're not really ever used at the same time. Okay, the first one, all right, we call these guys rods. Rods are a type of sensory receptor that basically look like individual little sticks. Okay, and we see them at the front of the eye. So, like so. Got a lot of rods at the front of the retina. And the job of a rod is to accept dim light. It's what processes images in low light situations. The second type, and probably the most useful for us, type of sensory receptor in the eye is known as a cone. Your two sensory receptors are rods and cones. And cones are at the back of the eye, and their job is to accept or process, get stimulated by bright light. And we have specific types of cones. We've got red cones, blue cones, and green cones that get stimulated by a variety of different shades or colors of light rays. So if we look at our rods and cones, we'll see that some of them are green, got green interspersed wherever. Okay, we got some green here, some green, whatever, green. We're going to have some blue cones. Oh, hey, there you go. And we're going to have some red cones. Okay, interspersed. Now, all right, got some green right here. Oh, and we'll throw in some blue here too. There's a reason that I've made a concentration of dots right back here in the eye. Okay? When we're talking about the actual eyeball, we know that the vast majority of light rays do come in straight into the eye, especially bright light. Okay? So we do have a higher concentration of rods and cones in the back of the eye there. That's known as the fovea, this little area. Okay, and it's just a higher amount of cones, basically, to help process images. Now, if we look at the actual eyeball, we see that there's an area in the actual retina that doesn't have any sensory receptors in it. And that's the area that leads to the optic nerve. So inside the eyeball, that area with no sensory receptors is called your blind spot. So it's a spot that you can't actually process images at, but that your brain has evolved to actually fill in when it's missing. So you see things, you're basically, your brain is telling you something's there, when in reality you're not actually seeing it. Okay? It's filling in the missing space is what it's doing. And the last thing I really want to talk to you about is what's going on inside the actual eyeball. Because if you press onto the sclera of your eye, you'll know that your eye is actually very pressure sensitive. So what keeps the eye as a really big spherical ball is a vast amount of another kind of clear jelly called the vitreous humor, which is found on the inside of the sphere of your eye. Let's talk about really quickly our light ray. So our light ray comes in through the cornea, through the aqueous humor, through the pupil, through the lens, into the actual vitreous humor, and it stimulates our rods and cones. And those rods and cones get stimulated, and then they leave that actual stimulus. That stimulus follows all of them down to the optic nerve, which then gets sent to the brain, to the optic processing area in the occipital lobe. And that's how we actually process sight.